Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. One of the core divides through the Trump era in both academic and public discourse has been the quote, fascism debate. Namely, can Trump and his movement be termed fascist? I've generally been on the side that they can, and I think the balance has shifted recently, especially after the 24 election, with even real holdouts like Corey Robin, Samuel Moyn throwing in the towel. While mainline publications usually avoid the term, it's certainly become more common in progressive writing. That does, though, raise a subsequent question. If this is fascism, was it always fascism? Is what we're seeing now simply the mask-off version? Or was there a thing called conservatism or the centre-right that was destroyed or overrun? Call this second debate the conservatism debate. I recently wrote an article for Liberal Currents arguing for a disjunction model, that conservatism is meaningfully distinct from fascism, although it's clearly been captured by it. This provoked a really incredible response, a very, very high level engagement with the argument I made, including a round of subsequent essays, some from the centre right arguing that I was too quick to dismiss their tradition, others from the left arguing for a continuum model, that it was fascism all along. The most comprehensive of these was by my guest today, Silvaria Lysandra Zemaitis. Silvaria, welcome to the podcast.
Well, hello. I'm glad to be here. I am happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you. We've both essentially written like public-facing academic articles on this. I wanted to start before we jumped into the issues with like, how have you found the debate and the public reception to both of our works and the stuff people have written about us? I've personally thought it was really positive.
Yes, very much the same. Very much the same. Like I've enjoyed and so much of the response the to the articles and the debate. It's been very positive, very illuminating. There's been a few things that I've disagreed with, that I've been like, no. A few times where I felt like they tried to make a counter argument that I felt I already addressed, but for the most part, it's been very good. It's been very like I have very much enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're always going to get people you feel like haven't fully read or understood your essay. That's just the water we're swimming in. But of all the stuff I've written, I don't know if this is the one that's been the most popular, but I'd say it's the one that's had like the most in-depth engagement. Like people really like giving very serious and I certainly include your work in this, giving like very serious and considered responses, which is, I think, really great.
So a lot of this is because so so when you're post, especially on Blue Square, especially on the internet, I there is sort of a gap between in my opinion, people's understandings of what conservatism is, like, and how they experience it. For some, like, basically, some people experience it as okay, bad policy, bad economics, bad ideas, even hateful ideas, hurtful ideas. And some people experience it more directly, like as causing active harm to them. So that means that there becomes it adds more of an emotional balance, more of a urgency. So and more of a built-in hostility to these conservative ideas.
Yeah, and I will say in general, I find conservatism, sort of going through this whole debate, possibly the most challenging ideology to study. I think, with all political belief systems, there's going to be the tension you outlined between sort of understanding it in terms of a particular formal model and understanding it in terms of lived experience. Conservatism beyond that is, I think, just tricky. Like there's no academic consensus at all on even what sort of thing we're talking about. And while there is certainly a lot of bad writing on fascism, there is kind of a core there amongst people who study it about like what we're talking about. But with conservatism, I find there really isn't. Everyone's just flying blind, and you get the full range of like epistemologies and viewpoints working on it.
And the thing with that is because conservatism is so amorphous in like what kind of like policies that it will enact. And sometimes conservatism will be free market, libertarian. It'll be like the market will regulate itself, or we can we must lower taxes in order to unleash business productivity, or but or things along those lines. We must deregulate in order to like set the market free in order to like make the market more efficient. But in other contexts, you'll see tariffs. Econ you'll see Dirksisme. It's hard to say that word. It's hard to say that word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
You'll see economic control. You'll see cartelization. You'll see massive government spending. You'll see big deficits. You'll see a lot of economic management. You'll see almost in some cases you'll see something that's not too far off from central planning. So, like just on the economic axis, you have this you have this situation where a conservative can say for one thing and a conservative can say for another thing, and economically in terms of economic policy they're completely different, so it's very incoherent.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons I like my model. And I say my model, I'm borrowing very heavily, as you know, from the ideological theorist Michael Frieden in my description of conservatism, which defines it more by its values than its policies, partly by its policies, but mainly by its values. Is it does give you a model that gives you a bit of a through line of what is stable and consistent to conservatism, when, as you say, it does appear really all over the shop sometimes in terms of its policy commitments. Before we get to that, though, I did want to start this conversation because I'm sure we're going to pull apart on certain areas, with one note of disagreement, which is we employ quite different theoretical models, but we actually both end on the same punchline. When it comes to what do we do now, we both ended our essays with a very firm rejection of this idea that we have to resurrect conservatism. But you hear this all the time. Certainly I've heard leading members of the Democratic Party say all the time, we need to have a normal centre right again, and we've just got to get back to like business club Republicans. And I guess you can kind of see the appeal of that, like they're better than this lot. But to my mind, I think that's a bit of an illusion and a pernicious one. And I think to yours too, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Like it, and for what, for so the fact is that door is closed. That door is closed. Conservatives, the right, have by and large, and not just in the U.S., but in but across the world, have decided that they can't win through the democratic process, so they are going to seek to subvert it. So really, you're talking about a fundamental incompatibility with the kind of restored democratic order we want and the actual conservatism that exists. But going beyond that, we have to look at what conservatism does when it's in power. It's not about just like lower taxes or maybe less regulation, but it is about less rights for people. It is about less for specific demographics. It's about more social hierarchy. It's about people like me having worse lives because we are lower on their totem pole. So from not just from a logistical standpoint, but from a moral standpoint, we can't go back, because when we talk about going back, we're basically saying that we're okay with letting our moral and ideological commitments fall by the wayside for the sake of stability. Because stability can look great on the surface, but who is benefiting from stability?
And I would also add on the note of stability, I think it's probably largely illusory because when we talk about going back to what, like the conservatism of 2015, well, we know that leads to the conservatism of 2016. We're talking going back quite a way at this point,
This
potentially generations. And it seems to me like even though in my model conservatism is a distinct thing, it had clearly lost belief in itself and clearly didn't have a lot of real conviction politicians anymore by the time you got into the Obama era. Like, fascism just swept over it like fire over deadwood. And I don't know, as a liberal, how I'm supposed to try and resurrect an ideology that couldn't fight for itself. Like, I also just think I'm not going to be effective there. I will be at my most effective trying to talk people into a progressive liberalism because that is what I am. I'm a progressive liberal. If someone wants to come along and try and resurrect a centre right that's maybe economically libertarian but doesn't go in for all of this anti-democratic and bigoted stuff, fine. I'm not like against that, but I just don't think I'm going to be well placed to try and do that. I don't think I'm going to be persuasive. I think if we are able to give people an off ramp from this, it's just going to be to our team. I don't know that we're going to be effective at that, and I just don't think we should try. That's kind of my point of view.
I agree with this, but I definitely agree with this. But I would also add on, when has that conservatism ever existed? Have we had this Chamber of Commerce, neutral to positive on social issues, don't um maybe they just advocate for lower taxes, lower regulation, a little more for more market dynamism, free trade. Have we ever had an institutional Republican Party like that? Like there have been a few Republicans individually that have kind of embodied that, like say a Jack Kemp or I'm actually drawing a blank right now.
You might have a bit more luck in the UK or European case, say John Major, say, right? Someone like that, maybe.
Yeah, maybe John Major, maybe somebody like that.
But even
Maybe
in the UK,
the recent May, I think that would be an okay example. But even then, that was kind of fraught.
But even in the UK case, I would and I did give in my essay Thatcher as an example of a sort of conviction conservative politician. But Thatcher was very hostile to gay rights, quite famously with Section 28. She was pretty hostile to the ending of apartheid in South Africa. This is not like there was a strong libertarian bent to Thatcherism, but I quite agree. I think when people who take my side of the debate, that there is a distinction, can often look at what conservatism was with very rosy glasses. And what I was trying to do, at least, I don't know how successful I was, but what I was trying to do at least was offer something of a disjunction model without looking too charitably on what conservatism was. Conservatism has always, as you've said, had these elements within it that are hostile to feminism or gay rights and so on.
Correct. And the thing about it is that so this is something I kind of get into in the essay. We are when we look at what conservatism does, it's it's generally along these same lines. There is generally along it's when we talk like you mentioned earlier the extra human order. That's kind of what it always does. It's always kind of structuring society to defend this extra human order. But what is this extra human order? Like actually that is a good thing to get into. What exactly is the extra human order?
You asking me?
Well, how would you frame it? Because I have a way that I framed that phrase. And but I'm curious, like, what you mean by that phrase. Because I think it's pretty similar, but I just want to hear it in your own words.
Yeah, so I'm taking this directly from Frieden, particularly his 96 work, Ideologies and Political Theory. The extra-human order is what it sounds like. It is the idea that society is structured by things that we did not create and cannot control. Now, in a lot of conservative writing, they will use the word natural. Freedom doesn't use natural because there are some types of extra-human order that are not necessarily naturally arising. So something like the quote-unquote laws of the free market could be sort of a non-natural extra-human order, but they are nonetheless extra-human. It's often said, and I quote sort of Thatcher as saying, the fundamental laws of economics cannot be changed. Now, what's interesting and confusing and kind of perverse, frankly, about conservatism is what that order is imagined to be often changes, is often in a state of flux, and often sort of spans different domains. It can be both the sort of quote unquote laws of the free market, but it can be also um, gender roles that are imagined to be essential and unchangeable. Um, so the extra human order is what it sounds like, but then there are other orders within society that may form hierarchies, that may have systems of domination within them, that conservatism imagines as man-made. So conservatism will usually regard something like the welfare state as man-made, whereas the market is not, which is, to my mind, what differentiates it from fascism, but perhaps we can get there. But it's an umbrella term, the extra-human order, to capture the core of conservatism, which is that there is an underlying order to societies that is not set by us, cannot be changed by us, but can be known, can be predicted, and can be preserved. And if what I'm talking about sounds like bullshit, it's because it is, but I think that is what is core to conservatism.
Okay, so let's break this down because I actually drew heavily on Frieden in my response, and I basically kind of took a different interpretation. So when we talk about the free market, when we talk about say nationality, when we talk about race, when we talk about gender roles, they're actually very similar. Actually very, very similar. And what and you can actually kind of reduce these to a few core aspects: race, gender, the concept of nation, and class hierarchy. And you see this basically basically every iteration of conservatism, just expressed in different ways. So, and these are power relations. These are all power relations. So so basically freedom is on the right track. Applying freedom is definitely on the right track. But you look but the ideology of the extra human order is is actually not the core. The core is not actually the terminal end. It is a justification for the terminal end, which is to maintain these power structures to ensure that the rich are have power over the poor or middle class, that men have power over women, this that cis people have power and domination over trans people, that people of the dominant ethnicity have power over the non-dominant one. It's basically the terminal end is the power structure. And the ideology is just there to to naturalize these structures of domination. Because naturalizing is a tactic that the power structure resorts to, and I am kind of anthropomorphizing it, but that is a tactic that is like sort of an emergent tactic to basically make it difficult for these ideas to be challenged because these ideologies did not exist in comprehensive form until you started seeing more liberal challenges to it. You didn't see you didn't really see like some of these concepts of hierarchy until you had, say, the more egalitarian the more egalitarian religious orders rise up to challenge like these power structures. You don't see like sort of the idea that queer people are quote unquote degenerate until you see more visibility in modern society for queer people. Black people in slavery, you don't see all these theories of these of race science. You don't see the mud silk theory. You don't see this presentation of slavery as a positive good until you see abolitionism. You don't see even Burke, and I mentioned this in the essay, you don't see like this comprehensive response by Burke until you see the French Revolution, which was more comprehensive in its challenge to entrenched power structures. So what is happening is that these power structures are sort of stochastically generating their own defenses against attacks. And part of that strategy of defense is to make these hierarchies natural, to root them in nature. So even the idea of an extra-human order, as you acknowledge, is bullshit, is itself a defense tactic.
So I think there's a good amount of that that's right. And, in framing conservatism as a set of ideas, ideas don't exist independently of power structures, right? I'm perhaps a little skeptical of a model that makes them wholly an emergent property of them. But certainly, to maybe go back to an to give a completely different example from the non-modern age, there's an argument from Orlando Patterson that one of the reasons you see such vicious misogyny in ancient Greece, even relative to the standards of the ancient world, is because there was something of a proto-feminist movement there, like the patriarchy was under some sort of an attack. And you can kind of see perhaps fragments of that in Plato or something. Whereas in perhaps a society in which the patriarchy is more secure, you get this sort of more benevolent sexism. It's all about protecting women and cherishing them and so on. So I can see that. Certainly, obviously, power structures generate a response. I think there's also something to the idea that ideologies as we so all of the big sort of thick ideological traditions of the modern world really find their sort of formative expression in the middle to sort of late 1800s, and sort of in the freedom model this isn't an accident. That's because when the rate of change in society, both technological and also sort of social change, really picks up at a level where it's no longer deniable. Like where you are at the end of one generation is very different to where you were at the beginning of it. And so, liberalism, socialism, conservatism, in their own ways, are all attempting to make sense of an accelerating rate of change. And conservatism isn't simply a defense of the status quo, it's one vision of how we manage that change. And part of how it thinks we manage that change is, as you say, a protection of those hierarchies felt to be natural. I guess my challenge back as making that the entirety of our account is that there are many hierarchies that may in themselves be quite brutal and oppressive that conservatism does not protect. So I gave the example in my essay of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is a fictional character in Jane Austen, who was really disgusted by the idea of her family marrying into a family that is not because they're not wealthy, but because they make their money in trade. To her, the natural hierarchy is the rural rent-seeking aristocracy. Now, in the time in the time that novel was set, the Industrial Revolution had been there for 50 or 60 years. You had factories, you had people whose wealth was built in that way. And certainly you'd had a mercantilist class in England for centuries. But nonetheless, to the rural landowners, that hierarchy wasn't legitimate in the way that theirs was. And then you go forward to the modern age, there's all sorts of, the nation state having large and expansive governments is a hierarchy and not always a benevolent one. And that's not one that conservatives have regarded as legitimate. So I think my challenge back would be not no, but yes, and yes, conservatism has a reactionary element. Yes, conservatism often seeks to defend established power. But I don't think that can be all our model is of it, because I think it has to account for the times when conservatives don't defend hierarchies and indeed may attack or undermine them.
Okay, so let me hit on those examples, kind of in order. So the first one, you basically have a royalist landowning aristocracy versus essentially market actors, industrialists, and the like. Am I
Yes.
correct? Okay, so
Yeah.
so in our modern context, they kind of just get flattened into the rich. But in that context, this is something that is kind of part of a core part of the Marxist narrative. You have the bourgeoisie challenging the aristocracy for power and social influence. So that's kind of the broadest context of that narrative where yeah, where the bourgeoisie is rich, they're making money off trade, but the aristocracy is not does not see that as legitimate because that is a structural challenge to their power. So that is that will fall into what my view of hierarchy, where conservatism is an idea that legitimizes established power and delegitimizes challengers. Similarly to the state. And again, conservatism has been very incoherent on this. And I think you mentioned the welfare state specifically. Am I
Possibly, but that's certainly one example, though.
okay? So the state in general is really about what the state does. Does the state entrench its traditional hierarchies or does it undermine them? And you will see that inconsistency in conservative thought and conservative thinking. And while there are sometimes some attempts to cover up that hypocrisy, it makes most cases they just slide from one to the other without missing a beat. Like, and with the welfare state in particular, that is something that is was specifically designed and devised to counter established power, to give workers bargaining power against the powerful. And of course, at this point, the bourgeoisie, the mercantile class is part of the upper class. They've they've become like a ruling, a powerful class. So so the welfare state has become a challenge to that. And that's where you get a lot of the free market anti-state ideology. And you can see that because when you look at the people who fund and supported like the more free market ideologies in the mid 20th century and before that, you see a lot of powerful m- merchants, powerful industrialists, and powerful landowners. Like the Volcker Fund was literally built from a rich guy's fortune. And you
So, no, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt.
and you see many examples of that. Heritage founded by very rich, powerful actors. Cato Institute, same deal. And you see all the way to now with like with the tech right, which kind of went mask off and said, you know what? We're all conservatives now, we're all fascists now. We want the quote unquote natural order back. We were just pretending to have progressive views, be- but now we feel like we have the whip hand and we can go reactionary.
So I agree with most of that, and I think this is where historical materialism as a model of ideology has something to say for itself, because I think there's a sort of crude form which says we live in a capitalist society, therefore we have capitalist ideology, and a sort of mature historical materialism that says in any age, there'll be different and competing hierarchies, and the hierarchies that have sort of different structures and internal logics. So say a mercantilist class versus a sort of rural landowning class will sort of generate different belief systems to justify themselves. That all seems that all seems a fairly plausible model to me. At least it's a model that you can join up all the dots internally. It still seems to me, at least, like you haven't answered the challenge because I've said, look, but there's different hierarchies, and conservatives will sometimes defend one hierarchy against another. I think you need some account as to why they choose one versus the other. Now, a very obvious answer is because if you're embodied within one of those hierarchies, you'll default to defending it. So Lady Catherine de Bourgh is a landowning aristocrat. She's going to default to defending that. Fine. But I think in every age, you'll also see people who don't benefit from those hierarchies reflexively, one of the points I always sort of make is ideology is certainly related to power structures, but it's not wholly an emergent property of them. I have met millionaires who are socialists and homeless people who are free market libertarians. That in both might sound a bit weird, but they're both real people that I've met. And conservatism, particularly in the modern age, particularly post-printing press, is an ideology that's shared. And when there are competing power structures, it will have to make a decision which of them it backs. And that decision changes over time. But what I hear you as saying is kind of like, well, conservatism backs the bad ones and it opposes the good ones. And sure, but like you need some sort of rationale to say why on your side you say some are bad and some are good, but also why on conservative side, what makes, in virtue of what are some hierarchies bad and are others good? That seems like the missing piece to me.
Okay, so I would say in some of those examples, right? Slightly lost my train of thought. Okay, so when we talk about okay, a multimillionaire is a socialist or a homeless person is a free market libertarian, I d- I try not to have essentially like to completely remove agency. Like every person has the agency to believe what they want. I think we're more speaking of tendencies. Tendencies aren't universals. So there are exceptions. There are people who I don't want to say go against their own interests because obviously interest is a multifaceted thing, but there are people who oppose things that would seem to be helpful for them in a demographic. Like after all, Blair White is a person that exists, just for an example relevant to my demographic.
Hmm.
Clarence Thomas is an example that exists, etc., etc. It's more of identifying a tendency than trying to impose a universal. But beyond that, and basically my thesis is that like conservative defensive hierarchy will reduce to these main axes of race, gender, nation, nation, and class. So in many cases, you'll see prioritization. For example, somebody may be opposed to one hierarchy but support another hierarchy. And in many ways, conservatism is a coalition. Like conservatism, especially now, can be coalitional. So, and the danger of the coalition is that it can become incoherent, but the strength of one is that it can tie multiple social hierarchies together and create a coalition to essentially create an omni hierarchy, like basically defend all the hierarchies at once. And one point I made in the essay is that in recent times, we have seen sort of a, a more encompassing challenge to hierarchy. Not so, instead of a civil rights movement, or just a feminist movement, or just a gay rights movement, or just a workers' movement, is basically all at once now. And I used the word intersectionality, I'm sure you're familiar with that term, to describe this phenomenon where you are seeing all the hierarchies being challenged at once and making demands of society for equal treatment, for to be valued equally. And and in the face of that, you see the defense of those hierarchies kind of hardening and radicalizing, especially the, when it seems like the average person has a lot of reason to not support that in a democratic society.
So I want to bring your attention back to one word you said, because this is a question we got when I put out a call for questions, which essentially was someone said, I like Silvara's account, but I'm worried it removes agency from the right. And this is also a concern of mine. I'm not saying you're saying this. In fact, you're not. But there are various narratives out there about the rise of the right and the rise of sort of modern fascism that remove agency in a way that I find really misleading and harmful. So, one of which would be what I call reactionary centrism, which is the idea that, oh, woke went too far and this is a backlash to it. And so and I'm concerned by that, not just because I don't think it's the right structural explanation. I'm concerned by its implications, because the implications are if woke went too far, then maybe we sort of just need to knock off all this pronouns nonsense and have less immigrants. And just if we calm down on our side, they'll calm down on theirs. And I think every bit of evidence we've had from the last 10 years has shown that that isn't the case. We can moderate on our side. We can make really ugly concessions to their side, as the Labour government has done, and it won't matter. It won't calm them down. I I'm skeptical of any account that takes agency away from the right. And is there a danger in sort of saying, oh, well, this is just a reaction? It's just because they feel challenged, in that the takeaway people will have from it is that it's our fault. And that I because I'm not sure I see that we were at a sort of zenith of attacks on traditional hierarchies when, certainly there's all sorts of social justice movements, but we've had, what now, three democratic presidencies in a row who've been premised on the idea of trying to restore national unity,
Mhm.
who've been premised on the idea of trying to find big bipartisan compromises. Like fascist, the sort of traditional hierarchies, I'm not sure were under existential threat during the sort of 90s and early 2000s. I think there were all sorts of compromises on the table that would have allowed them to sort of plod on in awkward coalition with liberalism as they had for the last few decades. I think people chose to reject the world that as it had existed for one or two generations. I think people chose to try and reset us to a pre-civil rights era. I think these are decisions people made, and I want to keep that decision element. central to my narrative because I think having that decision element keeps the moral culpability for where we are
Mhm.
on the part of the people who have done this to us. I don't think we're here because woke went too far. I think we're here because powerful people made a decision that they are not willing to accept even small constraints on how they can treat those below them.
Okay, I am I definitely 100% agree with how you are presenting this. I love it. I love hearing it. And I will say that these two models can very much coexist. It can be, it can be true that civil rights advances, social advances created a reaction within like people who are reactionary who benefit from those hierarchies that led them to take measures to stop it by any means necessary, including the destruction of democracy. But that is very different from legitimizing these actions on a moral level, because because if you're a liberal, those hierarchies were never legitimate in the first place. Those I think it is core to liberalism. It is core to the liberal project, the Enlightened project, that those hierarchies are not, have never been, and will never be legitimate. So that is how so when we say these powerful people and really powerful men, mostly but not entirely powerful men.
Agreed.
And when we say that, yes, these powerful men reacted in a fascist way, that is just descriptive. That is not legitimizing because the hierarchies that they are defending are fundamentally illegitimate and immoral. And so they have chosen immorality. They have chosen their defense of an illegitimate hierarchy over the stability of the country, the democracy, human rights, freedom. So basically, from a liberal perspective, and we're here because we think liberalism is good. We think liberal rights are good. We think humanism are good. From our perspective, those they have chosen an immoral choice. They they could have just let these changes happen. You're right, is an overreaction. This wasn't, we weren't going around trying to, oh, what Dice's scum or whatever was not on any Democratic Party platform. It was on it was on Tumblr. Kill all men. That wasn't in any Democratic speech. That was on Tumblr. But it doesn't matter because any challenge to those power structures produces a violent reaction because those power structures feel that they have total legitimacy. They feel like that's just how nature is, that's just how reality is. And they feel like any deviation from that is some fundamental violation of quote unquote reality.
Do you not think, though, there's an element to fascism that's even more pernicious than that? Because I wonder if this account makes it sound a bit too rational, that people have power and they want to defend that power and they'll lash out when it's challenged.
Oh, there's
To me,
absolutely an emotive aspect. Um, basically imagine like sort of like an abusive man. He's very cool and charming in public. In public, he treats his wife with respect and all that. And then when he gets home, he's angry. He's very like hostile. Maybe it doesn't like get physically violent, but you could see but the power dynamic is there. And then his wife starts kind of being a little more assertive, kind of talking back more. And that's when the physicality starts. That's when the beating starts. That's when the force comes in. That's when the yelling gets louder. That's when the anger comes out because there is an emotive aspect to the challenge to these power structures. And I think fascism kind of brings that out. And here's the thing about like that kind of violence. It's not purely emotive. It's not like completely irrational. Like the abusive, angry man doesn't usually does not flip out at his boss. Usually does not flip out at the police officer. He so even that is actually an expression of power.
So, like, I like that model, and I've sort of compared the sort of language we use to justify abuse in both the personal and political sense a lot of times. Like, I almost want to say to me, what you're describing there is conservatism. Like those two modes, the abuse, to take your model, the abusive husband who can be polite and whatever in public. Um, because we often have this sort of question, right, of what happened to Burkean conservatism, or, you mentioned, or one of us mentioned earlier, the idea of the sort of business club conservatism. That's the that's the abusive husband when he's out and about, right? Like,
Yes.
um, and to my mind, conservatism it can have a sort of dormant phase where it sees the extra-human order as being reflected in society. Then it can become quite passive and quite gentle and seemingly quite affable, even. But to the extent it sees the extra, to the extent at which sees society as being taken over by power structures that are human-made and not don't have this sort of extra-human sanctification, it can become very vicious and very radical indeed. So I would almost, to my mind, both of those sides are just existing conservatism, which is why, incidentally, I really reject the idea that this is something that we have to restore. Fascism, I think, adds some stuff to that. Fascism is not just partly rational and partly emotional. Fascism is flatly irrational. Fascism takes that and takes it to levels that are profoundly destructive of the people whose interests it purportedly serves. Like, all of the fascist mid 20th century states fully destroy themselves and collapse and kill a whole load of their own people within what, 4 or 5 years. Fascism adds to that the fantasy of not just preserving some elements of society and destroying others, but a total rebirth of all social institutions and social orders and all people within it. It adds to it a nihilism that I think conservatism doesn't have, that nothing matters and maybe we'll all get killed and maybe that will be good. Like, I think one of the reasons or many people are resistant to the idea of conservatism is different from fascism, is they don't want to sanitize conservatism. And I agree. I'd almost say what you're describing is conservatism to me. And then fascism is when it just fully goes off the deep end and goes nuts.
Right, but it is still basically the same process. It's basically like if to take the abusive husband further analogy further, the wife finally leaves him and he basically loses all restraint. He starts screaming at his boss. He starts like being violent in the streets and that's kind of where I would go with it. Like first,
Maybe he does like a murder suicide and is like,
right, yes. So yeah, and you actually do see that kind of thing where like you see like a murder
and maybe,
suicide.
sorry, one more point, just to put in my point about agency. Maybe there's not even a provocation. Maybe he just loses his goddamn mind and is like, me as a being a man requires I kill my family and myself. That happens.
Yes, yes. And that's the thing, though, is sort of is sort of that sanctified concept of masculinity and manhood, and that's a lot of what fascism kind of dips into. That almost psychotic, that completely irrational, like vision of masculinity, which you are seeing today, by the way. You are seeing that with Trumpism.
1000%.
Yep, it and basically the core aspect of that, and where you see that progression from conservatism to fascism, is that conservatism works within the institutions because it feels like the institutions are, as you said, reflecting that social order. Fascism is basically when conservatism finds that the institutions are insufficient to defend that social order. Like there are real differences between Bismarckian, the Bismarckian social order and the Wilhelmine social order and the Hitlerite social order. But the biggest thing is that while Hitler agreed on a lot of of subs on basically everything substantively would say Hindenburg, Hitler felt that the normal mechanisms of governance, those institutions, which by the way were already very authoritarian, they were insufficient to bring about that restoration of the social order. So the only thing left was violence. Violence to cleanse the nation from those influences that had quote unquote corrupted it. Of course, the Jews, but also homosexuals, queer people, disabled people, democracy itself, leftists, liberals, anybody that is seen to have undermined that conservative social order.
So this is where we get to like what to me is like the $64,000 question. Is like, do we even disagree? Or are we just saying similar things in very different models and with kind of like a different emotional valence? Because if you asked me to, can we get all political ideologies down to a typology of just two? I would do regressive and progressive, and conservatism and fascism would be within regressive. And then I would say, okay, if I can do more than two, I would make like subdivisions within that. And I guess this is just like a sort of judgment call of like, to what extent do you emphasize the continuity versus difference. But like I guess to my mind, like to just go with the model we're going with, to have a guy who's not a good husband or maybe abusive to completely loses his mind and decides the whole family and him has to die, that seems like a big enough step that you might want to put a category distinction there. Like, it doesn't seem wild to me that, yeah, they're both bad. And, like, certainly if you're subject to that power, they're both bad. But you might want to, in your labeling, put them into a different schema.
So for me, that entire process is downstream of an epistemic framework that puts him as the father and husband and head of the household at as like the most important source of his identity and nothing else. Certainly not the agency and humanity of his wife and the rest of his family. Those are very diminished in comparison. So it's basically from the same root. I use a temperature model. It's basically the same concept. It's the same power structure. It's the same epistemic framework, but at different temperatures. So we have a low temperature. So we have a low temperature who just like maybe just yelling at his wife, talking down to her, demeaning her. And then we have a mid temperature where it's you see the physical violence, you see like the the verbal abuse, and then you have the highest, the maximum temperature where you see the homicidal violence, the worst elements of the violence, but it is all along the same continuum.
I mean, so I would agree that there's commonalities you can put there. You know, to put it in my language, I would say they're both regressive ideologies. They both imagine a return, which is a sort of much more abstracted way of saying that, but I don't think inaccurate. I guess one potential distinction is I think in my account, I want to emphasize the role of ideas a bit more. And I think sometimes that can sound a bit like, oh, you're sanitizing. And no, no, people do terrible, terrible things because of things that they believe about the world, like, the classic example is if you really believe that your religion will take you to heaven and other people's religion will take you to hell, like, if you really believe that as like a physical reality, you can pretty quickly justify some pretty appalling stuff on the basis of that belief. And and saying that yes, there's a commonality. I agree. There's a commonality. What I would call regressiveness. What you've sort of said this sort of anyway. It seems to me like your account is very much like there's an input which is like people challenging the social order, and then an output which is conservatism or fascism. Like it seems to me people just start to take the case of the abusive husband. You can imagine he's not a nice guy to begin with, but he starts getting drawn into manosphere content and then into really conspiratorial stuff. And he starts to then believe conspiracy theories that everyone's out to get him. And he goes the full nuts murder suicide route where he wouldn't have but for those ideas. And in a similar sense, I think something similar is true of fascism, in that it always had these inputs of liking domination and wanting to protect the social order. But then you get these ideas like death is good and glorious, and violence is good and glorious, and that the entire order needs to be reborn in order for life to be worth living. And I don't know, I worry that your account doesn't have that as much space in it for like just people believe incredibly dumb stuff and do incredible evil in the world on the part of ideas, which is not to negate the role of power structures. It's both. But I don't know, I kind of don't want to lose the ideas part.
So I understand where you're coming from because obviously there is room for agency, there is room for choice, there's room to kind of stay at the bad husband level and not like go full on into like the psychotic manosphere type, but it's a tendency. And basically, like he basically the appeal of those ideas is to people who already deeply believe in those power structures. Like obviously, I have zero interest in manosphere culture. That is repulsive to me. That is repellent. But but maybe a man who feels like he is entitled to say, I'm entitled to a wife. I'm entitled to have this traditional nuclear family. I'm entitled to certain things because I, quote unquote, I am a white man. And that is how you get these ideas being generated. And these ideas have to be generated to begin with. And these ideas were generated usually by men who have these similar pressures, who have these similar grievances. Like that's why we have the divorced dad stereotype. That's the divorced dad has in many cases lost material power that he once had over the family, the nuclear family. So that creates an incentive, that creates a push to generate these ideas, to generate these manosphere ideas, which then influence others.
Let me give you my model of how a conservative becomes a fascist, and you tell me if there's a disagreement there, or if I'm just saying the same thing as you in different language, because I'm actually not sure. So, because I mean, one thing you could challenge me with is, well, if they are different, you know, a lot of conservatives clearly became fascists quite quickly, right? Like to your mind, that's to use your metaphor, turning up the temperature. But like my side has to have an account of that. So here's how that looks like to me. Is conservatives, are embedded within power structures, and I think certainly a lot of what you're saying about like those power structures will predispose certain people to certain ideas. Obviously that's true. I think also conservatives have this set of ideas in their head, and it's tricky to talk about because it's a set of ideas that is simultaneously quite abstract, that's bullshit, and I think is largely subconscious. But they have a set of ideas in their head that kind of codes the world into natural hierarchies or extra human hierarchies, and artificial hierarchies that are to be rejected. And so conservatives will support those individuals and institutions that they see as reflecting extra-human hierarchies and not support the other ones. So there's some sets of existing conservatism isn't just protecting existing institutions. It's kind of like a differentiation mechanism for which institutions you'll protect. So, as I said, when society is mostly taken up by existing institutions that you see as extra human, conservatism can be quite docile. But to the extent that that shrinks, you will become more and more radical. Now, that can be because of some objective change in the world, but it also can just be to do with your coding. It could be that nothing in the world has changed, but the number of institutions that you see as having that sort of sanctification gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And you can see this in how conservatives describe their own radicalization. They say, I used to support the free market, but now I see that all of these big corporations are taken over by woke Marxist feminists. Now, let's just posit that actually nothing has changed in those corporations, but they've come to code them differently. They used to have extra human sanctification, and now they don't. It can be a response to progress. It can just be a response to ideas. But as what they see as the existing human social order shrinks, they become more and more radical until essentially it disappears altogether. And once it disappears altogether, and this is how conservatives do describe their own radicalization, they say, I realized there was nothing worth conserving anymore. And that's where you get the mythic past. That's where you get the nihilism. That's where you get the irrationality. Um, is I think conservatives, there's clearly a sort of trajectory for them to become fascists. And that's kind of how it looks like in my head and my model. Does that align with yours, or is there something you'd want to push back on within that?
So I believe that is basically correct, but I think, and I think it's just almost like a semantic ar argument, it's basically lying in like
Yeah, this is
basic.
what I'm pushing at. Like, do we actually even disagree, or do we just have quite different rhetorics and framings? Sorry, go ahead.
I think it's a bit of both, in which it's more of points of emphasis. Like, look at like the example you give, woke Marxist feminist. So it's the specific kinds of desanctification that is occurring. There's specific kinds of sanctification. And that's kind of where I bring it back to the race, gender, nation, class. And it's important to understand that even people who aren't in a certain class, when you mix that into the other hierarchies, you can sort of like you can make a person feel like they're in one of those upper classes. So like even within even with poor whites in the Civil War, you could get them to identify with the slave owners just because they were white. But I digress. Basically, the whole concept of the extra-human order basically falls along these same axes. And the thing about that is that these changes are perceived changes are also a change in the perception of how much power that person has in society. They feel that they are less powerful. They feel that they are less superior to the demographics that they thought they were superior to. So that as that advances, as say being a Christian has less comparative valence, has comparative visibility to say being trans, which is why Eric Erickson just lost his shit over like you saw that tweet by Eric Erickson, right? Where
I'm
basic
not sure I did.
okay, so basically there was a tweet by Eric Erickson, redstate.com, where he's responding to Trump, basically not only basically doing his like whole thing threatening Iran.
Oh, I did, but refresh the audience.
Okay, so basically there was this tweet where let me pull up the tweet because I think Erickson.
So Trump threatened to destroy an entire civilization,
Yes.
and then Eric had that dude said something to the effect of, "Look, is this great? No, but I'd rather this than Trans Visibility Day."
Yes,
That's the
exactly.
one you're thinking of,
Yes.
right?
Yes, that exact tweet. Basically, this you guys are great that Trump is talking about destroying entire civilization, but this is way better than having trans people be visible on Easter. And like it's actually funny because like Trump even baited like the Islamophobia with like praise Allah, which is just God in Arabic, but whatever. And that even that didn't move the needle for them because they felt that the idea of trans people having visibility was so offensive that society just needed to be burned down and rebuilt because that to them that is such a violation of their imagined extra human order that, like you quoted, there's nothing worth conserving.
But I would say the trans one is in some ways the trans one, sorry, the virulent transphobia of the right, um, is in some ways a good example for my sort of like high agency account. In that there's always been trans people and gender non-conforming people, but it's become an issue because powerful people within our society have decided to make it one. In the UK, which is an even more extreme case, if you can believe such a thing, this was just not something that was ever. I mean, not to say our society was open-minded and tolerant, it wasn't in all sorts of ways, but this being a political issue is a very modern thing. And the statistic I always give is in 2012, there were 60 articles in the British press in all of that year about trans people. In 2024, it was 7,500. So it had increased two orders of magnitude over a decade. The media essentially just decided that they were going to hound a minority out of public life. And, that did not come from trans people like being more aggressive in their advocacy. If anything, LGBT advocacy in that period somewhat moderated. It did not come from new sort of frontiers of progress. The big legal change, the Gender Recognition Act, had happened in 2004. It came, the underlying conditions of society hadn't changed that much, but a handful of people, all of whom apparently were employed in British media, just decided they were going to absolutely go nuts over this. And then that created a political reality that the rest of us had to respond to. And it's broken people's brains. Like I cannot emphasize enough how much like look up you might be familiar, like Graham Lynham or something like that.
Yes,
People
I am very familiar with Gremlin. At Gremlin, I thought it was Gremlin ahead.
you may be right, I don't care.
Me
Like
neither.
um but like it has absolutely rotted people's brains. And not even like people who were like on the right before, like people who were like on the center left, it's just broken them. But that was like a choice people made to make that a thing. It wasn't a reaction. That was something that was just done to us. Does that make sense?
So I'm going to I'm gonna kind of frame it in a few different ways. So trans people, I think, so I feel like a lot of the core of what we call this extra human order is specifically about gender roles and gender power. And trans people, I feel like that we represent a more elemental threat to that order than others. Basically because like there's a lot to get into, but essentially like the extra human order is is kind of rooted in the control of women and the control of gender specifically. So trans people basically like completely shattered that concept of an extra human order because we're basically citing womanhood and manhood not as these fixed biological, unchangeable markers, but as something that we can change, we can define for ourselves in a free society. So, as long as a free society coexisted with accepting implicitly or explicitly those extra human definitions, then there would not be that backlash. But once society began to elevate trans people a bit more, give us more positive visibility, not treat us like freaks or degenerates or whatever, then that in itself challenged the extra human order. Moderation did not matter. Like moderation does not matter here. It is just seeing seeing these people who are supposed to be below who are being elevated, and that is enough to trigger the response.
No, no, I quite agree moderation doesn't matter. I mentioned that only to say that it's not this model of woke went too far and people were just too vociferous on our
Oh, right,
side.
right, right. The
I
woke
actually,
went,
yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, the woke went too far is actually just that's just a lie that the reactionary center and the reactionaries tell themselves to essentially legitimize their project of violence. They is basically, have you seen that cartoon? Like basically where the guy is putting the swastika on his chest and is basically like, look at
You
what you
made
made
me
me
do this.
do.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, yeah.
exactly. It's basically that's basically what it is. It
Yeah,
is
agreed.
legitimizing it is legitimizing after the fact their move to violence as something that the oppressed, the marginalized made them do.
Yeah, I used the phrase, what did you say to make him hit you? To sort of capture
Yep,
that.
exactly.
Like, but this happens. One of the questions abuse victims get is, what did you say to provoke it? And I see that as directly analogous to the political sense, where we're forever saying, like, oh, what did Democrats say that, like, put young men off? Or what did liberals say that provoked this reaction? And instead of asking, what is wrong with them that they are behaving in this way?
Exactly, and I hate it. It irks me in discourse where we're so focused on how do we win back young men? How do we like appease them? Like, young women like also dropped off. Why do we not care about young women, young Gen Z women? Like, why don't we ask about them? Like, where
Yeah. And I mean, if you want to talk about who's changing the ideological landscape, it's young women. Like, young women are becoming much more liberal at a much higher rate than young men are becoming conservative. Like, there's a big gender pulling apart amongst young people, and it's happening across the world in most developed countries. But it's actually mostly coming from young women. Young
right?
women are more likely to identify as liberal now than they used to be by like 25 points. And they're substantively more liberal. It's not just that they adopt the label, it means a broader set of commitments to them. And that pulling apart started in 2016. I wonder if something happened then, you know? But that's not like how we like to tell it. We don't want to say that the right lost its goddamn mind and ran a rapist, and that has had predictable consequences among young women. No, we always have to flip the agency such that it's something that we're doing that provoked them.
Yes, and I believe that is, if not entirely conscious, is basically an example of these power structures defending and asserting themselves, trying to create legitimacy for this institutional, this widespread violence. And I think here's the thing. Here's one thing I wanted to get at, and I think that's kind of the big source of like the difference in valence between us. When we talk about these structures built on the extra human order, people like me, people who are marginalized, people who are Black, trans, queer, who are disabled, neurodivergent, who are disadvantaged, we experience these structures not just as ideas, but as ongoing structural violence. We experience them as barriers, we experience them as discrimination, we experience them as deprivation. We experience them as material structural realities. So basically, what I trying to do is to get people to engage with things like conservatism, like fascism, as structural realities. And I think that's where like the bulk of my objection comes from, just that focus on is conservatism like a bad set of ideas, or is it a power structure that acts on people's bodies and lives?
Um, I mean, it's both, right? I mean, I think like a certain amount of my writing is I want to bridge that gap a little. I want to sort of look at how the ideas people hold can be dangerous and can hurt people
Correct.
and
And
can impact. Go ahead.
and I will admit I was not as familiar with like your full body of work. When I read like more of it, I was like, oh, we're more in agreement than I thought. But I think it is important not just for us as two thinkers, but for the entire discourse to really center that structural, that physical, that relational, that existing, that model of existence that conservatism creates. And center that so that the harms of these ideas are always at the center. But I know, but yes, you have tried to bridge that gap, tried to emphasize the harm that these ideas can do to real people.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, my conservatism essay is that's much more on the sort of abstract academic end. I think if you like as you say, if you read some of my other stuff, that does talk about the immediate harms much more. But to be fair, I don't think I can expect someone to read everything I've ever written, before replying. You can take one piece at a time. And I guess you could say, maybe as my conservatism one was more on the sort of talking about ideas side of things. So maybe there could have been a bit more. I mean, it was already a pretty long essay, but maybe there could have been a bit more space in that for because I did sort of say as like I don't think conservatism's a good thing or a
Right,
wise
right.
thing, but maybe I could have added something to sort of say to sort of bring that home a bit more in terms of what it looks like to be on the receiving end of it. Maybe that's something I could have added. I don't know.
I think that's just hard for like somebody who's not like being hit by that positionality as hard. And I feel so like I think that is something that maybe like a person like me is most well placed to deliver. I think my bigger concern was also like sort of the meta narrative because you did not intend this. I want to make this very clear. This is not something you intended. This is not something you wanted. But a title like "It Wasn't Fascism All Along" will leave moderate conservatives who were fine with some amount of these structures, who would like to kind of lower the temperature, but not change out the stove to extend the analogy a little more. Basically, to make it so like, okay, we can just go back to country club conservatism, to the idea of country club conservatism, which has never really existed.
Yeah, we're agreed there.
Yep. Yep, just emphasizing for everybody who is listening.
Yeah.
And I just want to and I just want to let you to make it clear to impart that understanding that no, you can't go back. You cannot go back. And not only that, even if we could go back, that would be bad. Like, what year are we going back to? Are we going back to 2015? Are we going back to 2010 when, say, they were fighting gay marriage? Or are we going back to like 1984 when wealth inequality skyrocketed? Like, what year of conservatism are you saying we should go back to? And here is why. And I want to respond to that by saying, here is why that that's also bad. Maybe not as bad as fascism, but still bad because it's working off the same epistemic framework.
Yeah, and this is something that has concerned me a little in that, you know, in terms of, I think we have like slightly different epistemic frameworks, and yeah, fine. Um, that you never quite know how your argument's going to land and what people are going to take away from it. And I've done a lot of big pieces where I thought it was like pretty clear what the punchline was. And then, you get the responses on Blue Sky or whatever, and people are like, oh, so you're saying this? And I'm like, yeah, that's what you took from this. Um, I I worry about the potential implications of either saying it was fascism all along or saying that it wasn't. We've covered like the agency side and the flattening out and the that. But on my side, I do I do worry that if you say it's different, people will sort of hear, no matter how many times you hit this point in your essay, if you say it's different, they'll hear it wasn't that bad and we need to go back to it. And I devoted, 2,000 words to the end of my essay to sort of saying no. But I do still worry that, like, I put that into the world and that's what people are gonna take from it. I think there's people who just kind of want that to be true, as you said. I think what I tried to do, and I don't know how successful I was in it, but I think what I tried to do is say, look, I think people are going to go one way or the other on this. Some people, I think, like you, just have a strong instinct that the commonalities are more important than the differences. I think some people have an instinct that there's an important difference they want to stress. And I think what I was trying to do with that essay, and I don't know if I was successful or not, is say, look, even if you think there's important differences, and I actually pretty much agree with you that there are, the fact that there are important differences does not entail this conclusion of we just go back. Yeah, there were important differences. Were past tense. And that past was not a past that was uniformly good. It was a past that led us to this present. And at any rate, it's not a past we can resurrect. The future is going to be what we build from where we are now. Does that make sense?
Yes, I would say that there are implications for the kind of anti-fascist coalition we can build, that the kind of society that we are aiming for. Basically, I think my conclusion is more structural and more radical. Simply because if you accept that the old order was always was always fascist or always tending towards fascism, then you can then you really have to more strongly internalize that there's no business as usual to go back to. And that means your response has to be very structural. It has to be okay. What power structures wanted fascism and how can we undermine them? What kind of political order enabled fascism and how can we undermine it and how can we reverse it? What kind of political economy enabled fascism and how can we build a new political economy? So we basically we so in my view, I think is me trying to that take that further to a more radical, a more structural, a more transformative model of how are we going to change society to make it better.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And like I did end by saying, like, I think the future that comes out of this is one of us wins or one of us loses. And if we win, the future will be much more progressive. I think one of the things I've landed on with this debate is I think whichever starting point you take, you risk implications that I think are wrong and point us towards the sort of wrong strategic direction. I think if you say they were different, no matter how many times you bang the drum that we can't go back, if you start with where they were different. A lot of people will take the implication of, oh, so we just go back. I think if you were the same, no matter how many times you beat the drum of like, I'm not excusing it, I'm not flattening it out, I'm not saying we don't need to be alarmed, I think people will take that implication. And I kind of don't know what to do about either of those sides. I think those are just things that people want to believe. Um, and I do see it as significantly and in part to one of the ideas I keep stressing this is I think you're very concerned that we don't just go back to uncritically accepting power structures that gear people towards this. I think we both agree. I'm also geared towards like the level of ideas that ideas can be harmful and ideas can get people killed. And let's not go back to uncritically accepting ideas about the world. For instance, let's not uncritically accept this idea that there'll always be a centre right. Let's not uncritically accept this idea that some sort of mainline conservatism is like a necessary force. Let's sort of think critically about our baseline assumptions. And, maybe to someone listening at home, they might feel that those are both just two sides of the same coin. Maybe they are. But I think I do also want to stress, like, this is a moment to shake off a lot of, like, the baseline level assumptions that we bring to politics that when we really query them don't make that much sense.
Oh, I am so much in agreement with that. Like, I think that basically I'm kind of where I do not see us even needing like a right in the sense that we understand it. Maybe you'll have like a relative right, like maybe like people have posited sort of like you have a very progressive left and center, and you have like a more like class like market liberal, like social liberal right. Like basically like imagine if like you had a political system where like where like the furthest right point on it was Obama.
Yeah.
That would be such
Every
an improvement.
every election is 2016 Hillary versus Bernie because we all enjoyed that one so much, apparently.
I mean, that would be better than nothing. That would be better than what we have. Like, I would take that. I would take that all day.
Yeah, no, I'm only being partially facetious there. But yeah, like yeah, that's what I'm saying. There's always going to be political divides. I don't think we're ever going to all agree on everything, but maybe
We
you know,
basically all agree that that these social hierarchies are just not legitimate. Like, we could argue about like how big the welfare state rate is. We can argue about like how high taxes will be, but we all agree that trans women are women.
yeah. And we're over this I have to be a complete prick to everyone and adopt a sort of boring and abusive personality style because I'm a man. Like
Right, right.
I do agree, so much of like modern politics is just gender neuroses and like maybe we never get over them altogether, but to I think it's perfectly possible to be a guy and like at least comparatively normal, not whatever this freak shit on the other side is at the moment. Like, that doesn't seem like that impossible that we could get there in a generation or two.
Is all gender? Always has been.
Yeah, no, no, no. I'm a pretty big believer in the gender all the way down, sort of model of stuff.
Yes,
Um,
same, 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 same. So I think so. Let me get back to one thing you kind of mentioned about
yeah,
the alarm level. And I do think that in previous contexts, there was sort of like a minimization of alarm. I don't think that's true in 2026, except among like certain influencers. And I found that even then, you s- and this is not scientific. This is take this with a grain of salt. The people who are like not alarmed about like fascism, they've tended to be white. They've tended to be white men who are like, oh, I don't see a difference. It's just worse
no,
conservatism.
almost uniformly. A few white women, but almost uniformly white guys.
So that actually ties back into the power structure. That ties back into the positionality. If you're a white man, then fascism is not aimed at you. It is aimed at somebody else. You're just doing it with a leftist. You're just supporting the backlash, the patriarchal response, but with a red coat of paint. Is basically is the phenomenon of red brownism, is basically like fascism with a red coat of paint. And I think being able to see that actually like richens the analysis of politics very well. Being able to see that when it's a white guy trying to sound edgy or radical, he's basically saying that, okay, I do not really actually care about these power structures getting worse because I'm not affected by them.
Yes, and I want to add to that because I think it's even dumber than that. I think it's also gender insecurity. Men can be, straight cis men can be very, very precious about our gender identity and very scared of it being undermined in front of other men. And so what happens in, particularly American political discourse is because our politics is symbolically gendered. The right is male liberalism, the left is female. Republicans are the daddy party, Democrats are the mummy party. You get this real insecurity from both centrists and the left. And even though in theory these are very different political trajectories, it actually expresses itself in a very similar sort of way amongst both your Ezra Klein, Matt Iglesias types, but also against your sort of, online dipshit left or your pink Hassans of the world and so
Yes,
on.
yes, yes. Oh my God.
Which
Yeah.
is this idea that, like, look, I'm on the left. I'm not like a pro-Trump or anything, but I'm not one of those hysterical, cringe, annoying,
Oh my.
sanctimonious,
Yeah.
female-coded liberals. I'm one of
Oh
the
my
cool ones.
God.
I'm one of the
Yes. Oh
male
my
ones.
God. Yes.
And like I think it's actually not more. It's as dumb as that, and it's not more complicated than that. They're uncomfortable being symbolically gendered as female or queer. Like that's what it is, I think.
Right. Oh my God. Oh my God. I have so much to say about this. Every there's so many points I can just hit on this. John Fetterman, Graham Plattner, Ruben Gallego, like apparently something just dropped about him. Now the Swalwell guy, like, and it's all this like, oh, I'm a liberal, but I'm masculine. I'm masculine. And it's like, um, obviously Hassan, you also have like you have like Iglesias, you have Ezra Klein, who is actually defending Piker. So you're seeing this convergence among between like the quote unquote center left, quote unquote far left. And it's basically an anti-feminist convergence.
Yeah, or like we don't want liberalism to be female coded anymore. We don't want to be part of something that's female coded. We want the approval of things that are male coded. And I think, it is just female coded. Like the right are going to talk about soy boys and sipping liberals and cucks and whatever, because that's a rhetoric that works for them. It is what they believe. And like, so you get called a cuck. You get called a soy boy. Fine. I don't care what fascist idiots think about me. Like, and I don't accept those standards as like the most important things that I have to live up to. But I think a lot of men really do. I think it really gets under their skin and they act up in all sorts of ways because of it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, basically, like it's sort of like trying to assert that insecure masculinity, but there is also like sort of a functional element because we've just talked about like how women since 2016 have zoomed left. So, like, honestly, it could be as simple as wanting their cake and like wanting that sort of like aggrieved masculinity, but not like slamming the door on their romantic prospects. Like it sounds dumb, but like that could be part of it.
But so I wrote an article about like the dating discourse, and you're already rolling your eyes, and you're right to roll your eyes. But one of the things I said in that is, do you know what statistically is probably the worst thing you can do for your dating life as a young man is to be a conservative. Because about 70% of young women are liberals, and
Yeah.
about 70% of liberal women say they wouldn't date someone who votes Trump.
Yeah.
So just right off the bat, by being a Republican in today's age, you are torpedoing half, fully 50% plus of your dating prospects. Yeah, I think that may be an element to it. Or at the very least, you want to sort of still be able to fit in liberal circles, but you don't want the feminization that comes with them. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly,
I think so.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that actually presents a bigger problem because you might say you're a liberal, you might say you're a leftist, you might say, "Oh, I listen to Hassan, I like Hassan," but but your entitlement, your view on the position of yourself as a man versus the woman you're dating won't change. You'll still feel like you're entitled to certain things. You'll feel so that actually presents a danger to the woman who might be dating you. And you actually see this like on dating sites where like, and obviously I don't really date. I have not been on the market for 20 years. I am happily married. I'm a happily married lesbian. Girls. Um, but
Yeah,
but you'll
I've been
see them.
married forever as well, but it does seem like there is some there are some issues out there, shall we say?
Yeah,
No
yes,
one
yes,
seems
yes.
too
Lots of
super
issues.
happy.
But yeah, you will see like men who will say, "Oh, I'm not political," or "I'm just centrist," and that will be like. And also, there's another element of where these conservative men who are in hiding think they can convert their wife through domination. They think they can dominate their wife into being a conservative, and they will like actively talk about this.
Yep, listen, I'm going to put us a pause because we've almost done 2 hours. And we could probably do another hour on the politics of gender because it seems like we're a lot more in alignment on that one. But this was a real pleasure. I'm going to recommend people read both our essays. They're both on liberal currents. Is there anywhere else? Do you have a website, blog? You're on Blue Sky, right? Anywhere else you'd like to recommend listeners go to follow you?
I'm on Blue Sky. For the most part, for the most part, I'm not doing like political content. I do like more like fun content, like my interests and passions and hobbies. I like fashion. I like video games. I like cute things. I like cozy games. So like politics is sort of like something I don't like spend a lot of time on. I like I actually prefer like kind of like having my own little space where I am because sometimes I can get too into it and it's not healthy for me. So I like having like my little hobby spaces. But I'm so pretty much anything that you'll see from me writing wise for now, I may make a Substack, I may do something like that. That will that will be on that will be whatever gets published to liberal currents. But I may make a Substack at some point if like writing becomes more of a thing for me. Like, because I do have a lot of articles in the pipeline. There's a lot of
Yeah,
things that I want.
I saw from the liberal currents discourse you like working on a few ideas, right?
Yes, and I'd love to like give little previews of what I'm writing. So if you want to see like if you want to engage in my with my ideas in real time, you definitely want to become a liberal currents patron so you can get access to the Discord. Or you could just DM me because I'm in a million Discords and I might be in one you're in two.
Awesome. And you're rad trans lib or something on Blue Sky, something
Yeah.
like that?
Yes, Rad Translib. And this is actually sort of a play on a book by one of my favorite authors, who Talia Bott. She's been on at least one neoliberalism podcast. She's one of my favorite authors on feminism from a trans feminine perspective and a radical feminine perspective. And I definitely recommend you read her.
I'll have to put that on my list. I've got like a billion things, but it will go on. Listen, I'm gonna wrap because we've been going 2 hours.
Oh, absolutely. We're almost at 2 hours. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm glad we started and ended with agreement. That was nice. And then hopefully we shed some light in, the middle part on our essays and where we were coming
absolutely.
from.
And sometimes like talking about somebody who like mostly agrees with you can be very illuminating. and it's sort of like a steel sharpens steel type thing. Steel sharpens steel. So by talking with somebody who agrees with you but has some like substantive or focus differences, you can actually sharpen your own ideas. So I encourage it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and yeah, cheers.
Cheers. Bye bye.